I think art is one of the most, if not like the number one, most powerful tool to be able to create a better world, because the things that move us are the things that are memorable, that make us want to be better, change. So I do think the values, especially, like no matter what I write, my values are going to be present in it. Like my book specifically, community, family, this concept of found family, of what that can mean. I think those things are so important. I wanted that to be a central part of the book because that's the kind of world I would want to live in. And I don't think we necessarily live there right now. And so at least in this space, I can create this ideal, I guess, community for my characters and hopefully have other people see that and be like, oh, I want that too.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Riley Carroll as we take a communication perspective on making space for your imagination and world building through writing. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard from today's conversation partner, Riley Carroll. She is the author of What the Blood Sings, as well as a friend of mine. This conversation is the last for our February series, all about taking a communication perspective on, very broadly, art, creativity, and imagination. Throughout this past month, we have been in conversation with other creatives like Riley to ask, what are we making in our art and why does it matter? So let's finish off this series with Riley. Hi, Riley. Thanks so much for being on my podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Oh, me too.
Good. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to this all week, day, month, perhaps as well.
Oh, yeah. Ever since I got the idea in my head to say, maybe Riley could be a guest on my podcast, I thought, yes, let's make that happen. Obviously, I know you, but can you introduce yourself a little bit? And I know it's such a big question to say, who are you, or tell me your story, but knowing that we're going to talk about writing and imagination and communication today, maybe you can, kind of self-select what you want to share about yourself that feels like important for people to know going into this conversation.
Yeah, of course. So I obviously am Riley Carroll. I met Abbie through, I'll just give some background.
Please.
I met Abbie through when I was going through my master's in communication studies, and Abbie was working on her bachelor's in interpersonal communication, and I got the privilege of coaching her on the speech team. So kind of starting at the most recent, right? So I got my master's in communication, but I did that following my bachelor's in communication, where then I was on the speech team over at Illinois State University, and then I switched over and moved to Indiana, another I state, for Ball State University. Prior to that, I grew up in the Chicagoland area. I have always been a writer. I've always been a dreamer. I love my imagination. It goes wild every second of every day. So it's been begging for an outlet for years, which is why in August, I was lucky enough to release my first novel, which is called What the Blood Sings. And it is a trilogy that I'm still working on, book number 2. So there's much more to come. And I hope and plan much more after that as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited. And that's such a great introduction, because that's going to lead me into exactly what I want to talk about, which is imagination. And again, taking this communication perspective, what I'm so curious about is, I guess the broadest question being, how does one become a writer, or what are the stories that you were told that made you want to be a writer, but also like made you believe that that was something you could do? Because I know there's a lot of stories, the kind of struggling artist trope, that maybe people internalizing and talk themselves out of leaning into like creative passions like that.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question, because I feel like even how you phrased that last end, that it was exactly me. I did not think that I was going to for many years, I think probably undergrad on, I was like, I'm not going to be a writer. Like that was that was just a pipe dream I had as a kid. And it's a lot of it was growing up. I was drawn to writing. I constantly was writing things. I was outside of class, like writing short stories or first chapters to like, I don't know, young adult novels, and then emailing them to my teachers all through elementary school and middle school and being like, can you give me some feedback? I definitely had I'm very lucky. I had a lot of women mentors that were in the field of English, whether it was like reading teachers or it was my actual English teachers in middle school, high school that had the space to encourage that and give me that feedback, give me opportunities to actually talk about writing instead of, oh, I'm in my bedroom and scribbling this on a piece of paper and not sharing it with anyone ever. And so that really shaped a lot of it for me of like what writing meant to me and what I can actually do with my imagination. And so I feel like I was built a little in some ways to want to pursue writing because of that. But then I feel like I hit high school and I fell into I'm going to say trap because I think it is a trap that so many people do of like, be realistic, you know, you're going to college, you can be a dreamer, but you're also a kid that needs scholarships, right? To go to college. You are someone who's going to be in student debt, you know, you need to be successful. You need to be X, Y, and Z. I was an honors student. So they're like, oh, do something with yourself, you know, and art isn't often, I think for many people, something that society will view you as like you're doing something unless you somehow make it. And I feel like people that make it in many art spaces are people that were already there, already had a foot in the door somehow. And so that kind of really sat with me. And I was like, okay, I am going to go into teaching. Actually, I started as an education major in college and I was like, I'll teach and then maybe write on the side in background. And then as I went through college, I think it was sophomore year, I was like, you know what? I love communication. I think it's fascinating. I think it gives me opportunities to write, but in a research capacity rather than a creative writing capacity. And so I was like, this is my plan. This is what I'm sticking to. So obviously I went on to get my master's, still with the mindset, you know, I'm going to write research papers. I'm going to continue coaching speech where I have the opportunity to write with students in more of a technical sense, but still writing. I was able to, this is a little taboo, but you know, I've graduated out of the speech community, but I was able to write several creative works for myself and others in the speech community as well. It's again, a little taboo, but I did it. I'll own it. So I had these spaces to like, okay, I am writing, you know, I'm not a writer, but I'm writing. And that was enough. And then Abbie, you know about this, but I'm always happy to share it. My second year of grad school, at the end of the first semester, the fall semester, around December, this was December 2021 at the time. I found a lump in my breast and I was not able to get care or get it looked at for about 3 weeks. And so in those 3 weeks, my mind really went rolling. Yes, I had a worst case scenario constantly in my head. I was in the middle of PhD applications. I was waiting to hear back from schools. I was obviously going into my last semester of grad school. So the stress was abound, and I kept finding myself thinking, you know, if this is what I think it might be, if it is the big C word, what will I have felt like I did with my life? You know, what is it that I would want to do? If I go in there and they're like, you have 6 months to live, what did I do and what am I going to do? And the first thought in my head was, I wish I wrote a book. I wish I wrote a book so badly. I was like, I don't care about my master's. I don't care about getting a PhD right now. I was like, it's just time I'm giving towards something that is a passion of mine, but was not ever my like long-term to my core, what I felt like I was called to do. And so thank God I lucked out and my tumor was benign. So I still have my little benign tumor hanging out with me sometimes. After that experience, I feel like that was a changing point in my life of just understanding, you know, when you're actually faced with a finite amount of time. I think at our age, it's really easy, right? To just be like, oh, I have endless like buckets of time.
Yes.
Because that's what we've been like living through. And then the moment that you realize that time, it does end at some point. I feel like I turned internal and I just started to reflect on everything. And it made me see some truths that I hadn't really looked at as closely as I could have. And so since then, I ended up not pursuing my PhD. I kept thinking, maybe I'll reapply after a year, maybe the following fall. I still haven't. It's maybe a journey for me at some point in my life, but I don't see it right now for me, just because now that I have time and space to sit and write and have been able to share it, with more and more people. I feel like that's where I want to give my attention at this point in time. So that's kind of my long journey to how did I get to writing. And again, a lot of it was the discouragement of, this is going to be hard. You're probably not going to be great. You might be good, but like, you're not going to be great. Writing isn't accessible. Or you hear the J.K. Rowling story of like, she sent her transcript to so many different publishers and they all said no. And I feel like we hear those stories over and over and over, and it does stick with you. And then I was like, why don't I just, try? Like, what a concept of just going out there and trying, and being like, what, I know that those are stories, right? And they are accurate in some ways, but others are also myths. Like, they're these myths that we tell ourselves. And so I didn't want to live in the myth anymore. I wanted to just go for it, see what happens. And I'm thankful every day that I did give that attention and care to my practice of writing.
Yeah. Such a great point to say that it is this kind of like scare tactic. I don't know, like the stories that we are hearing are about like, well, all these people failed, so you might fail. And it's like hard when you're hearing these multiple messages, like at the same time, the world is like, don't be so afraid of failure. And also giving you all these stories being like, be so afraid of failure. It's the worst thing. You shouldn't even bother trying, because if you fail, it'll be so horrible. So it's like, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to think? And so, I'm glad for you that you had an experience that brought that to the forefront to force that reflection for you to be able to say, okay, what's really important to me right now?
Yeah.
And it's a shame that, we live in a world that's so busy, so go, values, productivity, wealth, success, certain things that don't really, go hand in hand with valuing or propping up creative endeavors.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had so many thoughts from what you were just saying, but that last thing you said, I was like, oh, that failure piece is so interesting as something that, probably a lot of people talk themselves out of, whether they are trying to pursue it for their job or just creating for the sake of creating. You even said, I'm not a writer. You're writing, like what again, a lot of people probably talk themselves out, be like, well, I'm not a writer, or I'm not a creative person. But I don't think it's that exclusive. It's not like you either are a writer or you are not. Anybody can write, anybody can create art or music or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think something that I write in my personal journal quite frequently about just like identity is this concept that I think myself, that I've learned through my writing, as well as many other people that I've come to recognize, are often intention. Like, I think this idea of you're this one thing, like your identity has to be this monolith. Like we talk about that in communication. We talk about it in podcasts, on blogs. Like the world talks about this concept, but I just feel like we aren't able to internalize it given X, Y, and Z in life. There's bills to pay, or I have to do this, or I need a job for my healthcare. I need all this stuff. Right. Like the world hasn't been built in a way that allows you to, like I said, like be intention. That's like my favorite term lately, is I just feel like I hate to say, oh, I'm a writer, because I'm also, a cat mom. I'm also someone that struggles with anxiety. I am someone who enjoys to watch trashy reality television. Like that can all be true, and I can still be a writer that has things to say, and even genres of writing. Like I'm writing fantasy right now, but I have long-term plans to write like I'd love to write horror. I've always been interested in horror as well. I could write realistic fiction. I feel confident I could do that. I just haven't yet. And that's okay, So I do think that comes to a lot of it, is this idea of like failure is, if that's not your sole identity, who you're going to end up being, it's not even worth trying.
If you can't guarantee quote unquote success by whoever standards, then don't even bother, basically, is the message, what it feels like.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think so many of us fall into it, especially with creative, like you said, because there's just not as much, at least in right now, this moment in time, I feel like there's just not as much value on creativity. And by value, I'm talking very capitalist.
Oh yeah, no, that's
value.
yeah.
So I do think, there's not money in the creativity.
Yes, thank you for saying it plainly. That's
yes.
I've danced around it in some of my other conversations to talk about creativity. What is it like? Creativity under capitalism. Of it feels so countercultural to create for the sake of creating again, when everything, because it is through the stories and through all of these messages we internalize that are teaching us what we should value. And so, it feels countercultural to value spending time being creative, again, for the sake of being creative, not necessarily because you can guarantee that it will be your source of income and you'll become massively wealthy because of it.
Exactly. And I feel like something I have noticed with like friends and family that I talk about the book with, usually the first question they ask when the book comes up is, oh, how many copies have you sold? Or, oh, how much money, what are your royalties at? And that blows my mind. And I just always say, oh, I don't know. And I check maybe like once every 2 months, because that's not why I did it, I guess, for me. And so it's been really interesting when I do respond with that of, I don't know what it is. It's somewhere. Or last time I checked, it was X amount of copies. People are like, oh, you're not looking. And I'm like, no, it's just, I'm excited by what I hear from people who have read the story. Like that is to be able to share something that is so intimate. I think writing is always intimate with others, people I don't know, people I know, friends of friends. That's like, that's just been so cool to hear how they react, how they feel, what they interpret from a story that I sat and lived with for a long time. Yeah.
Tell me more about that. What are you hearing from people who have read your book, and what does that mean to you to hear feedback from people?
Yeah. So it's interesting. The first thing, just because of like genre, because I am writing in fantasy. It's more adult fantasy is what I'm going toward. But I think young adults could enjoy it as well. Oh, sure. But I am finding that a lot of people are commenting on like the names and just the namings of things, because the names are all over the place. That's a little on par for fantasy. And I love that. Like, I love that I can just assign like random sounds to names, the characters' names. And I'm like, oh, that's what they're called, even though that's not how you pronounce their name. And so that actually that's my funny piece of feedback, is a lot of people are like, I loved it. I don't know how to say any of the names. And I'm like, you don't read fantasy that often, and that's okay. Like, we just accepted it in the fantasy community. Like, oh, whatever. Like that sounds like this, but it's spelled completely opposite. Whatever. So that's been kind of a funny piece of feedback that I'm like, oh, see, like, that's a perspective I wouldn't have even known about if I wasn't sharing this work with people who don't frequent fantasy books. But overall, honestly, I've been really, overcome, I guess, with excitement at how people talk about just the writing itself even. I have always felt like I can still tell stories. I always have stories. I think, like, whether they're fiction or real life, I think we've talked about this. You put me onto one of my favorite podcasts, the gossip. I can't remember the. Yes, it's about gossip and
normal gossip. That one.
Normal Gossip. Yes, I love that podcast. Because it just normalizes gossip, right? Like, gossip is a very natural thing, especially among marginalized groups. And I love gossip, and I love that. So I think I've always been someone who carries stories. Yeah. It's the technical aspect of my writing that I don't think I've ever been fully confident in. I don't know. I feel like I struggle to assess my own writing. It's hard for me to remove it from myself. And so without sharing it as much, or especially my creative writing, I was like, I think I'm good at writing, but I was like, but I don't know for sure sometimes. Like, I'm on the fence. And so I just feel like my confidence of just hearing people react to the actual writing of it, of like, oh, I was so engaged, like I could see what was going on. I understood what they were feeling. I can picture these characters. Like, the fact that I was able to just bring the story to life through my style was something I would hope for, but wasn't expecting. And so that has been some of my favorite feedback that I have been getting.
add one more voice to that chorus. Like I so enjoyed it. And I've told you that it was hard for me to get into it. So I was just like hearing your voice or just being like, Riley wrote this, Riley wrote this, Riley wrote this. But eventually again, and I would have to attribute it to your writing and kind of world building. I guess that I became so engaged that it no longer was a problem and I was able to enjoy it so much. And so the question that I'm left with as someone who has not written a book or even attempted that process, I'm just in awe and want to know, like, how do you even begin to create a whole world? And I think, again, to keep us on the communication perspective, I'm curious to hear your answer to the how question, and then think about how are we also building our actual social worlds? Because I think you're going to tell me about imagination, and that's something that we're just not in touch with. And we just need to maybe, you know, gain something from you sharing like how you're able to write a fiction book to answer how can we create the kind of world that we want for ourselves through, you know, our communication, through our stories for our actual lives too.
Yeah. So like I said a little bit earlier, I think writing is super intimate. And so it's a very personal process. And I think something that happened in this book, and I would say any of my writing, I think this is just kind of my overall philosophy. Every aspect of the book is like, it's a part of me. It's somehow my personality, it's my experiences, it's my values. And so I feel like it's an extension of me in some ways. I have been asked this, like, is this character you? Or like, did you base this character off of XYZ? And I'm just like, in some ways, but also in other ways, it's absolutely not me. And so I think that kind of gets a little bit at the, how do you build a world? It's because it's an extension. It's because I get to build on who I am. And so for me, that kind of process specifically looked like a lot of free writing, honestly. I have so many beginnings of books. I've always been like that. I love to write the beginnings of things. I've always struggled with the middles. That is where I trip up, even just the planning. I am a planner, but I'm not a planner. I think I'm a disorganized planner. So I always start with free writing. And so with this, I actually started with the scene in the book where Danya's in the chicken coop, and she's still in her community from before, and she's like ripping out her hair and she's reacting so strongly to something she had just gone through. And then her sister shows up and her sister's not understanding her. And it's just kind of this like feminine rage and frustration and breaking point. And I feel like that is something that many women have felt, right? Many women, non-binary folks, etc., have all felt that. I would argue at some point in your life, even if it's at a small scale, maybe not as extreme of a scale as tearing your hair out in a chicken coop. But I really wanted to play with that concept more. And I have so many other free writing pieces that deal with the concept, but this was one that I was like, oh, I really like this. Like, I feel like this could be the one. And so the characters didn't have names. It was just concept. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I don't think this is where I want the book exactly to start, but I think I want this to be toward the front end and have this be like an impetus moment to move the plot forward. So I kind of went back and was like, okay, let's figure it out. Here are my two characters that I want to start with. It's Quiba and Danya. I ended up naming them. I actually wrote the whole book with a different character name for Danya. And so
that's
sometimes
crazy.
I trip up. Yeah, I wrote it because I liked a different name, and then it didn't feel right at the end. And so I was like, I need to change it. And so Danya is actually very intentional. Yeah. It's a spoiler, I guess, in some ways, if you really look deep into Celtic mythology. I did some playing with it, but I guess that's just to say that writing is very malleable. It can change at any stage in the process. But I came up with those two characters, kind of fleshed out who they were. And then I started with that, where she starts, the community she starts in, New Strake, and she, I don't know, I just kept being like, okay, what does this look like? Now, what does this look like? What kind of conflicts do I want her to have? Like, I knew I wanted to explore gender violence in some regard, because was one of my main points of research all through grad school, something very important to me. So I was like, what leads her to this moment of feminine rage? And I felt like that was how I incorporate that. And it opened up space for me to make the story a little bit into a romance, which I love. I love romance books. Say it. I love them. I'm someone, I love to be in real life on my own. I do not date very often. I'm very independent. But I love a romance book. I think it is so valuable. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I get to hit all my favorite check boxes. It's a fantasy book, and I can make it into a romance, and I can have like a message on gender violence. And so all of that was working together. And just from there, it just kind of kept expanding. I was like, what else am I interested in? What are things I wanted to explore? I mentioned a lot of the names are based in Celtic mythology because I've always loved mythology. I'm Irish, and so I love to dive deep into my roots. And so I have multiple books now in my room. I was just reading about mythology, like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll bring that in. Yeah. And it just kind of blew up from there. I feel like every writer is going to approach it differently. And that was kind of my conception. And then from the moment that I started it up until maybe 2-3 weeks before I published it, I felt like I was consumed by this world. Like when I was walking to get groceries, I'm thinking of, okay, what about this? Or I want to flesh out what this area looks like. Or I was in Michigan a lot this summer. My parents have a camper out there. And so I would just sit by the lake and be like, okay, let's look in the water and see what I see, do some scrying or something. So I immersing myself and giving myself space to think on it. Yeah. And write notes as needed was just kind of my method to keep building. The language of like consumed. That's what I like to the most, just because I feel like I am someone who I love to consume. I consume so many media. I love to eat good food. I love to consume life. But I also simultaneously like to be consumed by things, especially in my brain. Like I feel like my brain is it's always been so quick. It moves so quickly. It has so much space and wants to go in so many different directions. So I feel like I've always been someone who has something to ground it. And so right now that grounding space has been my writing, just different ideas, letting the creativity live there instead of going in 50 different areas and being like, well, what about this? What about this? Or, I don't know, I saw this person on the subway and they were really cute. And I was like, that's going to consume my thoughts for the next 3 days. Like what kind of life could I have with this person? I make things up. I get consumed. And so now I have a place to put that habit, I guess. So that's kind of the process. And then I'm trying to think of the second part of your question was,
oh, just moving on to real world, but that's okay. I'll pause you there because I'm having
there's like so much there.
I know. I said so many things. I'm having like a choose your own adventure moment. I feel like where I'm like, I have 3 different things I want to say like equally. So I'm just going to pick one and hope to return to the other one because you're, kind of returning us to the second part. What I do want to talk about in talking about this space that you're giving yourself or that you were, able to cultivate for yourself to be consumed by your imagination. I think that's beautiful language. Something I think about a lot is that like boredom, and we're just
oh my gosh,
never bored anymore because we have an immediate answer to it at our fingertips with technology. And I think again, I haven't looked at any research or anything. I'm sure it's there. That's just a hunch that I have that boredom's actually really important because I see it being, it's like in that moment when you look around and go, I'm bored. Then 1, you have to problem solve. And 2, in order to do that, you have to use your imagination or creativity to come up with how to resolve the boredom. And there's not as much creativity when you go, I'm bored, I'm going to scroll on my phone.
Exactly.
And like you said, there's a lot of like really good media to be consumed out there. So that's not to say never, be consumed by media or consume media. But what are we missing when we are always doing that and never giving ourselves space to sit with our imagination? Again, it feels countercultural. Like all this, like there's such a value around busyness, go, go, go. Or like, you were saying that it took wondering if you were going to die in 6 months to give you the space to actually reflect on what you want for your life. Like what if
Yeah.
we all had the space to reflect on what we want out of our lives and to live from that and to be in a deeper relationship with our imagination. I just think it'd be better.
No, I 100% agree. I think that, yes to everything you said. I kept thinking as well, the idea, kind of going back a little bit, of like, we do in some spaces allow for boredom, but it's considered like a side hustle, or it's considered you need to be productive though in your boredom. Like I like the TikToks. I love TikTok. I do sit on TikTok all the time. I'll own that. But I see TikToks all the time of like, here's my 9 to 5 or my 5 to 9 after my 9 to 5. And I'm like, whoa, why are we like segmenting and calling it like making our leisure time into almost another period of work?
Yes.
And I am not the most balanced person. I'll own that. Like I could be better organized about cleaning my house, or I could be more on top of things. Abbie knows this. I am awful at responding texts to emails. It's not something I have ever been the strongest in, and so maybe those people that create their lives or structure that lives in their way, they might be able to do those things that are, again, I would argue, are considered productivity tasks in some ways. So they may not be bored, but how are you filling your time? And you're filling it in, once again, actions that are really encouraged and ingrained in us from a capitalistic society that we function under. And I think part of it, this idea of like, you have limited time, you get to almost pull out a little bit. Like, I'm going to bring in theory just because it's like one of my favorites. I love, it's not super calm, but it's Foucault. His idea of he talks about a web of power, of a society will always exist within an interconnected, very intricate web of power over us. And doesn't matter if you shift power from one place, it's going to have to go somewhere else. And he does talk about, though, that when there's disruptions in like our society and our individual lives, it allows for a space where it's not a full break, it's not a broken system, but it allows for a break in the web, for that web to reweave itself into something different. And I felt like that experience was my like break in the web. I was on a track in my life, and I don't know, I don't think it would have been a bad life. But I was on a track that I was like centering productivity and success by like other people's terms.
Yep.
And so I had that opportunity to break out of it, a disruption from my regular life. And I think that it has shaped me to be like, you know what, even my writing, like this free writing I was doing, it was never even an intention of like, I'm going to write a whole book based off this. It was like, no, you just need to make space to write. Just like do what you enjoy. And then it became something of like, oh, wow, this is just fun for me. I get to give myself space and time for that. So I don't know. It's so hard to remove time and energy and activities from it needing to be productive or having some like greater purpose.
Yeah.
But I feel like the removal of that greater purpose led me now to wanting to, publish this book and wanting to make it something bigger, share it with the world. And again, if I make money, awesome. That would be lovely, I guess. If I can get to a financially stable place where this can be what I do, that would be awesome as well. But I needed that freedom, I guess, from the side hustle. I needed to disconnect the two ideas. And so that break in my web was what helped me get there.
Yeah. I'll keep us on the theory train to talk about, the theory that I'm based on my work in CMM, and such a big part of that is an emphasis on our personal power to make new choices, tell new stories, communicate in better ways that lead us to a better social world. The whole idea is that our social worlds are created in our communication. So let's do that better so that our social worlds are better. And let's be mindful about the communicating that we're doing. And when I think about mindfulness, I think about, meditation or journaling or things like that, many different ways to be mindful or intentional in the life that you have. But I see it as like a practice. And I see it also as a communication practice. Like it is about, in the literal sense, practicing, how you want to be and hoping you can, get to a point where you can show up how you want to in every moment, in every relationship. And then also it's about like ritual in a sense.
Yeah.
So, maybe it's a combination of that to say that maybe it will take a big life-altering, web-breaking event
Yes.
to set you on the course, but maybe not. Maybe there is a way to, even under a, capitalist system, to carve out that time to be intentional, to be mindful, because you have to. It's not coming if you're, going through life on autopilot, because the world isn't handing it to you. You have to really create that space for yourself to do things like commune with your imagination and create and be mindful, or take time to reflect. And again, not to say that everybody has to write a book or even make any art, but if you are taking that time to reflect, then I think that's giving you such a better chance to set yourself on the path of what you're saying, what this all ties back to, of what do you want for your life? Yeah, it's interesting, the way that you talk about your story developing, that you started with something that's actually in the middle of the book, and kind of built back from there, because I see this kind of question of, well, what is a better social world? When we say we're working towards better social worlds, how do we define that? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it mean? Asking that is such a great question and requires imagination. And then the second part is to, kind of step back into the present and say, okay, how would I act? How would I communicate? How would I spend my time? What would I do? What would I put my energy towards if I actually believed that, if I, thought I could move us closer to that? And again, if you're not taking the time and space to reflect, then you're just doing. And that's how we end up in, what we call unwanted repetitive patterns, that you look around and you go, whoa, how did we get here?
Yeah.
And you actively contributed to getting there, but you hadn't cultivated a mindfulness practice or spent any time in reflection. So you end up where you didn't actually really want to be.
I think you're getting at a core of how we as society ended up here, and how we can move past it. I think this gets a little away from writing. Once again, I'm bringing up communication theory.
Yeah,
but
please.
I haven't read this article in forever, but there is a work by Dr. Ashley Hall. I know, or she was teaching at least like a year or two ago at Illinois State, which is partially how I knew her. But she writes this article that incorporates Afrofuturism, which is, at least in her writings, really painted it as a way for the first step for society to move into a world that, ideally would be, racism free, is to imagine what that world is. And that is such a core concept that just sticks with me, because it's honestly been a way that I've explained maybe to some of my family friends, that are not as social justice minded maybe as myself. It's a way for me to explain, they're like, well, why can't I do this? Or I had a cousin, he was like, well, I'm a white man and I want to talk about X, Y, and Z or something. And I was like, okay, maybe that's not the best topic for you to have a platform to talk about. You might not be the best source to discuss those topics. And he was like, well, I just don't get it. If I'm not the right source, what's the answer? What's the answer? And I said, the answer doesn't have to be so black and white of what can we do in this structure? It might not be something that solves, this issue tomorrow, but it is something that starts the process of well, if we can even imagine and picture a world where, racism isn't what it is, or it could be anything, sexism, any ism, the isms aren't where they at. If we can't even picture it, then how can we even start creating practical solutions? And so I live by that concept. And I think it helps a lot of people better understand, this is a long fight. This isn't just there's no right and wrong answer. It's about reflecting and thinking and creating. And I'm bringing it back to capitalism, but it's trying to push us away from the space to imagine and get better. It's pushing, it wants us to sustain itself, and partially it does so through taking our time away from the creativity, the imagination.
No, and again, not my intention, but in this whole February, this whole month of conversations I'm having with you and with others is all around kind of art or creative expression. And again, I don't want to have the same conversation 4 times, but all of my conversations in their own way have touched on that. I think it's kind of impossible not to talk about, capitalism, if you're talking about creativity and art and value, because that if we're, talking about the stories that inform us, or, what we'd call like different levels of context, it does include our culture and society and, the stories we get broadly from those places that shape us. I love what you were saying. And it's taking me back to one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking earlier is that, again, talking about, okay, what are the stories that shape us? And then how do we shape the stories? And kind of thinking of the question of, well, does life imitate art or does art imitate life?
Oh my gosh.
And I got to call that both for sure. And I'm hearing that in your answer of what you were saying of, well, my own life and my interests and my values do inform what I'm writing, do inform this art that I'm creating. And then also, I'd like to think that if we are writing stories, if we're telling stories about better social worlds, that in turn our life can quote unquote imitate that art, and our actual social worlds will get better. So I see it as this loop of we are, shaped by our stories, but also we're not totally powerless. We do have the option to tell new stories that then in turn make way for new ways of being in our actual social worlds. Like, whether it is fantasy or any kind of fiction writing or any kind of art, again, or artistic expression, movies, whatever kind of stories we're consuming, it makes sense to me that that's how we get our information of what is possible, what should I want, what am I allowed to want, what am I allowed to do and value, what has value for the society. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm bringing in communication again. I think art is one of the most, if not like the number one most powerful tool to be able to create a better world, because we talk all the time in communication, pathos, the emotion, is one of the strongest means of persuasion. And I think fundamentally any bit of art is going to be steeped in pathos. It's like bleeding pathos, just about, and so I think it's the things that move us are the things that are memorable, that make us want to, be better or change or whatever goals people may have in mind. And so I do think, like, even what I said earlier, like the values, especially, like no matter what I write, my values are going to be present in it. And I don't think it's even conscious for me half the time. I don't think it's conscious for many of us, but it's like those values, that's what I live by. That's what I try to live by. And so as other people engage with my work, I'd hope they see that and see the world of like my book specifically, community, family, this concept of found family, of what that can mean, of tradition and where you come from. I think those things are so important. I'm very family oriented. I'm very community oriented. I think it takes a village, period.
Right.
And and I wanted that to be a central part of the book, because that's the kind of world I would want to live in. And I don't think we necessarily live there right now. And so at least in this space, I can create this ideal, I guess, community for my characters, and hopefully have other people see that and be like, oh, I want that too. Like that's what I would want in my life. And a lot of people, like, a lot of the feedback I get is, oh my gosh, I just love the group. Like, I feel like you just have created such like a found family group or the friend group or whatever. And I'm just like, we can do it too. I didn't just pluck a friend group out of nowhere, it's shaped by all of my wonderful friendships I've had in my life, and if I could bring all the people I love the most into a room, that's what this would feel like. What I wrote in my book is what it would feel like if I was able to do that.
Wow. I'm so glad you're saying that. And I am like reflecting on, not just what I thought, but how I felt reading your book. And really something that did strike me so much was, like you're saying, the relationships. And it was this beautiful, like warm, fuzzy feeling, because I felt such like a love for all of these characters without, it's not just a, feel good story. Nothing bad ever happens, but there's like a depth there that even when, whatever the conflict of the story is progressing, people are, making choices that, don't do that. Don't do that. Please. No, I also am so invested in their relationships. And I have empathy for people when trying to think about what a kind of better social world looks like, and actually trying to make a better social world, because it is actually really hard to do something that's never been done before. And so
Yep.
to, I understand that to ask someone, imagine a social world that you've personally never seen or experienced before.
Yeah.
That's a challenge, not to say don't do it, because
Yes.
it's very important to do it. But it's hard to do something that's never been done before,
Yeah.
come up with an idea that's never been thought before, a new way of being, and then do it, So again, that's why I just think if the role that stories play,
Yeah.
writing plays, film plays, in helping us to understand what is possible. And also to kind of clarify like what we value, like you're saying, like, and as like reading your book and seeing these relationships, I was like feeling like this beautiful feeling, being like, oh, I want that for myself. Yeah. So I should go into my own life and, keep pouring into my existing relationships that I really value. Yeah. So it does, work that way, that it's not contained within the pages. Just because it's fiction doesn't mean it's, not real or speaking to something very real. Yeah.
No, I 100% get it. Because I feel like even when I read, I love to read. And I'm constantly seeing things or reading things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I love romance. I said that a little bit earlier, but I absolutely love romance. And I feel like I'm not the person that you would meet and just be like, oh yeah, romance is one of our favorite genres. Like I just don't maybe seem as gushy or how you would expect a romance novel lover to be. But I forever go as a different podcast. I keep referencing things because I'm constantly inspired and my thoughts come from somewhere. But it was a podcast talking about romance novels just as this, I guess, this tool to exactly what you're saying, create new social worlds, because it's something that men, because of, misogyny, will not touch. They're like, ooh, gross, and so it's this almost private space for a lot of women and non-binary folks to be able to engage with love in a way that they may not have engaged with it before, and see, or I relate so strongly to this character and look at how they're treated, and then you're able to identify, maybe that's not how I've been treated in my life, or, I have such a great partner because I recognize this. It's affirming. And so I think every book does that in some ways. I think romance, though, is such a great example because people don't take it as seriously, even though it is a way that shapes all of us. I think romance novels, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, even were probably consciousness raising devices, like they were literally able to be like, this is a good, like, this is a healthy relationship. You deserve this. This is possible. And what you're, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not getting this at all right now. Maybe what I have isn't right. Yeah. And I love that. I love that books can have that power and it doesn't matter the genre.
That feels really important. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily think that was my intention with my book. Exactly.
I know it's fantasy.
Yes.
But you write a really good romance novel, let me tell you.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
It's just such a beautiful feeling of the beautiful romance that you write in your book, and then so many themes. But the way that I see these stories coming to shape our real lives is when people can hear a story and go, I want that for myself. Yeah. And I want that for myself so bad that I'm going to figure out how to make it happen for myself, Again, even if your world looks totally different than the characters. Yeah. I'm going to pivot us a little bit because
please.
One of the things that I think was so compelling to me about your writing is that I just loved your main character. I think, people connect with books in different ways, and, maybe it's more common to be like, oh, I really saw myself in that character. I didn't see myself at all.
Yeah, right.
And the kind of part that I'm referencing is more like her way of being in the world. And you do such a beautiful job of like really letting us inside her mind and walking us through her thought processes. And just, her kind of decision making. And it is all this very like assertive and strong presence that, sometimes she's trying to convey. She, maybe doesn't even fully believe in herself. She just wants to portray herself as this. But as the story goes on, you really do believe her to be this kind of person. And you're learning how she's making decisions and how she wants to engage in the world. That's something she thinks about a lot. Yeah. And I've just always been such a little people pleaser. And so it was like... not to be so bold, but like empowering or like liberating almost to hear this story and fall in love with this character who's acting opposite to how I've generally acted. And to have that moment of, that's what I would like for myself. And that's what I could have for myself. This person has a perfect, I know it's fantasy, whatever, but it's, again, it's speaking to something real. It's real in its way. Well, this character has this kind of life and she's acting this way. Perhaps I could, also create a beautiful life for myself and also acting this way. And not to say that, quote unquote, people pleasing is direct opposite to the character you created, but those are kind of this kind of tension or dichotomy that I was noticing within myself as I read and related to this character and learned to understand her. That was just my personal experience, but that's my kind of personal example of reading something, wanting that for myself, and then wanting to embody it in my actual social world too. And so I guess where I'm kind of talking myself to is to say that it's so hard to imagine brand new social worlds for ourselves. So maybe that's where I see books, for example, coming in and aiding us in that process, bridging that gap between our imagination and our reality,
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think that at least with Danya's journey, especially, I know the book kind of starts out, you get to see a little bit of who she was for most of her life. Like, I definitely think a major change happens, right? That moment where she kind of lets the rage out, I guess. Like, she really comes into herself in that moment, and then following it. Like, I think the Danya that's the book started with and the Danya even in like chapter 15 is not the same Danya.
Absolutely.
And so I do think that's part of it, of like, yes, you can resonate, and you resonate with this post chicken coop Danya. But she was a bit of a people pleaser, like Quiva was always I'm just sharing, where I was coming from, I guess.
Please.
When I wrote it, is Quiva was always the one that was like firm. She was the firm sister, the firm one in the duo. She was the one who was like, well, I don't like those people, so I'm not going to mess around with them. I'm not going to try and play nice. I'm not doing this. But Danya was like, oh no, like I'll try. She does like little covert ways. She wants to be normal. At the beginning of the book, she wants so badly to just be like everyone else and just follow the path that was laid out for her. And it takes like that moment, I guess, of it not lining up and things not being exactly for what was already inside of her, that strong presence, that direct person, that brave person to come out. And so I would hope, I guess, some advice for you, is if you're already feeling like you want to be that person, it's in there, it's right there, it's ready to come out. It's just a matter of like when you let it out. It doesn't, again, have to be as insane as Danya's approach, or go through the same things that she went in, but I think it can show that change is possible. It's not just that Danya was innately forever this like strong character. And I mean, even as the series continues, I feel like the last book ended with her pretty strong. She's a pretty strong character toward the end, but she's gonna continue to go through her ups and downs, as everyone does, And so we'll see her challenge. We'll see her, in situations where maybe she is not the person she feels like she is at the end of the first book. So I don't know. I think that's also part of it, of being able to see the ebbs and flows. It's not this finite, when the book ends, when the pages stop turning, it's not like she just stops and is frozen in time as this great character that people can relate to or be inspired by. It's also, now she just keeps living her life. And you will get to see some of that in the next two books.
Right.
Following that, it's just, in what life do you imagine for Danya after?
Yeah, I'm again thinking about some language that is part of what it means to me, at least, take a communication perspective and talk about stories, plural, that we hold, and the different kinds of stories. And one of the models within CMM specifically that I think is so helpful is the loop model. And that's, LUUU, endless use, really. There's been additions and you could add as many kinds of stories as you wanted. But the first version of this model is, L for lived stories, and then untold stories, unheard stories, untellable stories, unknown stories. Ooh, and then the two T's at the end for told stories and storytelling. Obviously, this is where the name of the podcast comes from: Stories Lived, Stories Told. And then, so you kind of bookends of stories lived, stories told, but everything in between. And so I would kind of I think about untold stories a lot in that they shape us just as much, if not more, or in their own ways as the stories we do tell. So thinking about, for me personally, at least, like what your character meant to me and what I think your story probably does mean to a lot of people falls under maybe this umbrella of like representation matters. Because if it is an untold story to you that a woman can act in XYZ way, that is an untold story. Like, you've never seen it. Right. Right. And so it is, that's why the, language is not exact, but I would put it under this umbrella of like representation matters, to be able to see yourself represented or see helping to spark the imagination and like give different ideas of ways of being and, turning those untold stories into told stories by starting to be honest about them. And, other things that I think go untold or like messier stories. Like I think I've always said many times on the podcast of like, I feel like the stories that we least want to share about ourselves are the ones that we want to hear the most. Like if, it feels really hard to share like a vulnerable story about where you messed up, maybe where you failed, where you tried to become a writer and you failed, because you understand what society says about that story. But when other people share stories of their struggles, for example, or their ways of being or thinking or feeling, I feel like those are so powerful. And again, we want to hear more of those stories. So I've always thought about the loop model and the stories we're telling. I obviously think about that in terms of, the actual communication like I have in my relationships and the real stories that are being told. But I think, that model would certainly include stories like, your book fiction that we read, films that we see, art that we see, there's stories that affect us just as much, even though they're not, my story or somebody else's real story. It is a story that is, shaping us and affecting what we believe to be possible for us in our social worlds.
Yeah, 100%. I loved every bit of that. It just, that is so accurate. The untold stories. It's so fascinating of what goes untold and how even that, like how that sits in us. Like I definitely think in creative endeavors, especially, they are so ambiguous and they're so personal, but they can be impersonal. They can be an extension of yourself and sit outside yourself. And it's almost like a safe way to make those stories told that we're holding within ourselves. And so
that's a great point.
And so I love that. I'm going to be playing with that idea and during my thinking times, my boredom, that's where my brain's going to go now. I want to ponder that more. I really, I think that's fascinating.
Wow. Anything final words you want to share about your book, what the writing has meant to you, your creative process, any of it?
I think I would just say, go for it. Any listeners tuning in, go for it. Just try. It doesn't hurt to try. I hate trying because I want to be good at things, but I challenging myself. So I challenge you as well. If you needed a sign, this is your sign. Just try it. It doesn't have to be for anyone else but yourself. And then What the Blood Sings, available on Amazon.
Yes.
If anyone again ever is listening and is interested in the process of what I self-published, so I wanted to learn every step of publishing before I really pursued it. So I spent a lot of time researching Amazon publishing. So I just want to do a plug of, if there is ever an instance where you wanted to pursue that, learn more. I feel like there aren't enough resources out there about it. I think I put my email in at the end of the book. So if anyone wants to, if you want my email, you got to look at the book.
I got to buy the book.
Exactly. But I'm so open about it because I think that's accessibility issues and all that. So to explore your own imagination and creativity, there's always a community of people out there happy to help. And I'm one of the many in that community.
That's awesome, Riley.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yes, this was perfect.
I'm
so excited.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Riley. In the show notes, I've included a link to her book. I highly recommend it, as I'm sure you could tell based on how I talked about it during the conversation. At the end of each episode, and especially today as the end of our month's series, I want to offer some questions to reflect on. I see this as acting like a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop when the episode does. And today, the questions I would have you think about based on this conversation are, what can you imagine for yourself and your social world? And what stories make you think, that's what I want for myself, and how can you make it so? And as we think about the past 4 episodes as a series, I'm grateful for the way they've been able to contextualize each other, provide some additional depth across episodes, and help to see patterns and themes. As I talked about with Riley, it came up in every single conversation to talk about our larger context being capitalism and the way that that affects our relationship to creative endeavors like writing or creating art. That wasn't something I planned on talking about with any of them. It just emerged as a context that mattered and that these artists recognized. Another theme that I saw emerge was the idea of what I would call a bifurcation point, moments that had them question and reflect on what it was they wanted out of their life. And only then did they really choose to pursue their respective creative endeavors. For Riley, it was wondering if she had cancer. And for Sharon and many others, it was their experience during the pandemic. Also, as we talked about with Riley today, the character in her book comes to her own bifurcation point. And maybe we don't all have as clear of a before and after as that character, but I wonder what we can learn when we reflect on our own lives and look for the bifurcation points, the moments where we started making new choices and started telling new stories. I wonder what we can learn when we zoom out and consider the patterns and paths of our lives. Especially because this conversation wraps up our series, I imagine that we all have a lot to reflect on over the past month of conversations. I invite you to share your reflections with me as well as your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, through my website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all of those are in the show notes so you can find them easily. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. And another great way to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, sharing episodes. You can share this episode or any episode that has been meaningful for you. One of the things I'm trying to do for season 3 of this podcast is to cover as wide of a range of topics as possible, to show that a communication perspective can be applied to many different topics. My hope is that that invites more people to this podcast and community than would have found it otherwise. So as you think about what episodes you want to share, maybe you can choose based on the topics. Maybe you have an artist in your life that would be really interested in any or all of the conversations we've had this month. You can easily share episodes through text, but also you can post links to episodes in your Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or whatever other social medias you use. I so appreciate you as part of this community, and I just want to see it continue to grow. And if you do, you can tag me on Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, and on LinkedIn and Facebook at the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Speaking of, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds that we hope to create. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links I have included in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.